started. Welcome to the Republic of Work, our Lunch and Learn series. Republic of Work have a number of events aimed at upskilling and growing you in your business. So make sure that you check them out on republicofwork.com. And they also have a fantastic library of all the past topics that they've covered, from marketing, sales, accountancy, and wellness. So make sure that you do check that out. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon delivering this lunchtime Learn series on unconscious bias. It's kind of strange to be broadcasting from my home office. I was reflecting on the last event I did in the Republic of Work, which was way back in March. And it was just the week before we all locked down. It was for International Women's Day. So personally, I would prefer to be having, a face-to-face and meeting you all in person. And there's nothing like the buzz of an event. So it's a pity that we can't do that today, but we are where we are. Just a bit of housekeeping before I get going. If you wouldn't mind just keeping your microphones on mute, and if you want to pop any questions into the chat box, what I'll do is I'll look into the chat box at the end, or if you want at the very end, you can unmute your microphone and just ask me the questions directly. So I know there's a couple of people who know me who are on today and a couple of people who don't. So briefly, let me introduce myself. My name is Orla Berkery and I'm from Dragonfly Coaching and Career Services. My background is HR management and talent management and coaching. And I've worked in Ireland, the US and the UK, supporting regions such as Asia, Middle East, Asia Pac and EMEA. And I'm director and founder of Dragonfly Coaching, which is a business that's specifically designed to progress, dedicated to progressing the gender diversity agenda in business for women. So we support women individually, but we also work with some fantastic progressive companies through the programs that we deliver for them. And what I've discovered from my experience, that the drive to be treated equally and fairly, it transcends any geographical or gender boundary. It's not specific to men or women or culturally specific or unique to any one group. It's something that we all want. And I've discovered this through research and working in organizations and with organization. Nobody gets up in the morning and decides that they're going to discriminate. Nobody I've met anyway. And nobody consciously decides, today I'm going to let my bias decide. Discrimination really comes from a series of small micro decisions that lead us into bias and stereotyping and inequality. And it's often unconscious, which is why we're here today. Now, my expertise lies in the field of gender diversity, but what I found is that any exploration of bias uncovers how it affects men, women, people of color, people from the traveler community, people with disabilities, and neurodiverse people. So with that in mind, I'm here to explore unconscious bias with you, and let's begin. So unconscious bias, it has its roots in stereotype, assumptions, and inaccuracy. And my objective here today is to raise your awareness so that you learn something new about unconscious bias. Recognize what bias is and recognize where it comes from. And I'm going to share with you the impact of unconscious bias on both individuals and organizations. And finally, I'm going to suggest some strategies to deal with your unconscious bias so you can become more inclusive, both inside and outside of work. So unconscious bias, it's always been important. However, with the changing nature of society, it's ever more important. In Ireland, we have seen huge change over the past decade with marriage equality, migration, immigration, and our last census revealed that we've over 200 different nationalities living on our small island. So we need to be ever more conscious of the role we play in making our society more inclusive and equitable for all. And businesses have a responsibility too. How we respond to things like Black Lives Matter and calls for gender equality is important. In the context of society and business, leadership is what matters. How reflective of society is our own government when we just look at how it's made up? There's 4 women in cabinet, and it's racially and ethnically fairly homogenous. This matters. Trump. I'm not going to start bashing Trump today, but it's important because Trump recently issued a diktat to US companies that they should not use the terms unconscious bias, male, pale, and middle-aged in their corporate training. And if you just think about that for a moment, the message is that it's okay to have these unconscious biases. If you compare this with somebody like Jacinda Ardern, who 2 weeks ago appointed her first Maori female foreign minister and the most diverse cabinet in New Zealand's history. 25% of her cabinet are comprised of Maori ministers. Leadership matters, and organisations need to be reflective of society and the communities in which they serve and operate. So our conscious mind and our subconscious mind, we all know the term in 2 minds. We have what's in our awareness, our conscious, and what we're unaware of. Decisions, where do they get made? Well, they get made here and here. And you can see the problem. When decisions that get made out of our awareness and in our subconscious, they don't always lead to the best outcomes or the correct ones. Why? Because they're not thought out properly. Consequences aren't considered, and they're like automatic reactions that are often rooted in stereotype. So unconscious bias is a positive or negative mental attitude or a social stereotype about people or groups that we hold. And we categorize people based on things such as gender, profession, social class, or any other category. And then we make associations between these categories and attributes. Sometimes we're not even aware that we're making these associations and assumptions, and that our biases take over and we discriminate against others, or we judge them unfairly. Now, at this point, I think it's important that we understand the terminology and the language that surrounds unconscious bias before moving on. So diversity. When we talk about diversity, what do we mean? What does diversity mean to you? If you're thinking people of different color, race, ethnicity, background, well, that's right. That's all correct. It's all of those things, but it's also a range of characteristics that are seen and unseen, those that we're born with or those that we have acquired. So diversity is broader than just our race or our background or our sexual orientation. And while it's largely a function of our demographic, it's not always. Inclusion then. It's a function of our mindset. It's our beliefs and our actions. Inclusion in the workplace is a conscious effort to welcome and value diverse employees. It values all perspectives, and it enables every employee at work to contribute to their fullest potential and be valued for it. So on this side, we have diversity, a collection of different unique characteristics, and this side, we have inclusion. It's when each part is valued equally and appreciated for what it can bring. Equality versus equity. These 2 terms are also very, very closely aligned, but different. Equality is the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, or opportunities. And it's so important it's protected in our legislation here in Ireland. It's the fair treatment of people regardless of their gender, race, civil status, and a lot of other characteristics. Equality treats everybody equally. Equity treats people differently, dependent on their need. So as we can see, both promote fairness. Equality gives everybody the same resources, regardless of their need. Equity gives the resources based on the need of the recipient. And I think this illustration makes the point. And I wanted to bring this to your attention because I believe we can't have a discussion on unconscious bias without understanding the importance of these terms, because diversity, inclusivity, and equity must be valued if we're to counteract the effects of unconscious bias. So, back to our unconscious mind and the role it plays in our biases. If we think about something that we do on a daily basis that's a habit, driving a car, working on a routine task, things that were once difficult for us are now easy. Our brain takes over the hard work, and the task, or the driving, gets committed to the subconscious part of our mind. And this is a good thing because it's efficient and it avoids us getting overwhelmed. My son is learning to drive at the moment, and I don't know if anybody has had the pleasure or the misfortune to sit in the front seat of a car with a learner driver. You'll understand there's so much for them to learn and to do. There's actually quite a lot to think about at the same time. And this is the kind of stuff that I take for granted, and I'm sure other seasoned drivers take for granted as well. Over time and with practice, these tasks will become automatic and we end up doing them without effort, which is good. One of the functions of our brain is to convert as much as we can into our subconscious, so we don't have to think about everything all the time. And we've evolved this way to be able to navigate around our world without spending too much time on the little small decisions. Our brains take these shortcuts to help our decision making, but such decisions may not always be correct. So I'd love you to look at this slide. And if you look at the right-hand side first, and then if you just take a moment to try and read what's written on the other side. So, according to the law of closure, things get grouped together if they complete some entity. And our brains often ignore contradictory information. And what it does is it fills in the gap in the information. So in the image, you probably see the shape of a circle and a rectangle. And you could probably make a good effort at the jumbled up sentence. Why? Because your brain fills in the missing gaps to create a meaningful image and make sense of the sentence. Our brains always fill in these gaps to make meaning for us, rightly or wrongly. So unconscious bias, it's a daily occurrence, it's automatic, and we're hardwired to be like that. And we can see that our brains are wired to take these mental shortcuts, just like driving the car, but we make quick, inaccurate, snap decisions, sometimes without realizing it. Inaccurate, incomplete, and incorrect information that leads us to do this simplified reasoning, which is fine when we drive the car, but it becomes a problem when we unconsciously use this process to judge people. And this is what stereotyping is. Snap judgment, quick decision, usually negative. So for example, if you were to assume that a woman has children because of her age or is likely to have children, and you had a job that required long hours, or if we ever get back to travel, significant travel, would you prefer to give it to a man just because you assume that she's not going to be able to do the job, or that men aren't as involved in their parenting, or they don't have childcare responsibilities? This would be an incorrect assumption. So, where do our biases come from? Well, in fact, they come from all these places. And if we're to challenge stereotypes, biases, it's important to understand this. We all have these biases that come from our parents, our education, our background, our culture, and our experience. And they shape our views, and they shape our views of groups, people, and situations. They can help shape our views of what we expect people to do in work and how they should behave. When we think of people like engineers, scientists, doctors, what images come immediately to our minds? Is it male or female? Is it a white person, a person of color? Is it a thin person or a person who's heavier? Our upbringing fuels our biases, and it can limit the limitations we place on others or the expectations we place on them. And this can create a lot of problems in the workforce. If I were to say or make an assumption that Irish people won't succeed in a role because they're lazy due to the expectation, it would be horrifying to all of this. And these are the things that we do when we let our backgrounds and our subconscious fuel our biases. So I want you to consider for a moment, just pause and think, who is in your circle of trust? Think of 5 people that you trust and you socialize with on a regular basis, apart from your immediate family. Okay, so we have a few people there. How many of your inner circle belong to a different group to you? We know diversity relates to various groups that we could belong to in society. But when we look at our inner circle, that core group of people, we can often be surprised at how similar these people are to us. But is it really a surprise to us? Because as human beings, we gravitate toward people who are like us with shared interests or values, or people that we just click with. We feel we know them. I don't know, but it's happened to me on so many occasions where you just meet somebody and you think, yeah, I feel like I know them my whole life. I've just clicked with them. This is what's called the affinity bias. And this is a tendency to trust more people who are like us, and it's instinctive and it's unconscious. However, this tendency can also push us to distrust people who are different to us. And the affinity bias is really interesting because it goes back to a time when we lived in small little communities, way, way, way back in history, and small tight knitted groups with little contact with the outside world. And anybody who came into our group would be viewed as a threat. However, now we live in a much more diverse world, and the affinity bias can create and does create problems. For example, in the workplace, think about a situation in which you have the power to hire or promote somebody. Would you tend to hire or promote somebody that you trust the most? This happens every day in business. I recently got hired for a project through a former work colleague. She knew me, she knew my work, and she recommended me to her company. And was that good? Yeah, it was great for me. Absolutely. And on the surface, there's nothing wrong with that. It's the power of connection, it's the power of networking, it's the power of reputation. However, now imagine the scenario where there was me and 2 or 3 other people who were going for that interview for a job in that company. What impact may the affinity bias have had on their chances of getting the job if they looked different, sounded different, or were outside the inner circle? People like us. So in decision making, particularly with people like us, affinity bias discriminates and can often exclude the best talent from being considered because it's out of our awareness, and we don't ever really stop to say, is there an objective reason for my decision, or is there an objective reason why I trust or prefer one person over the other? So what other biases may there be? Well, there are many other types of biases. Ones you may be familiar with here, or ones that you haven't seen before. In fact, if you Google biases, you will come up with 185 different forms of bias. So we're just going to cover a few today. Confirmation bias. We look for behavior to confirm what we want to be true. For example, if you have the belief, whether unconscious or consciously, that a certain category of person is sneaky or untrustworthy, then you will see every little behavior of that person who belongs to that group as confirmation that they are sneaky. If you have a belief that women are more empathetic than men, that is what you will seek to confirm in your dealings with women. Gender bias. This does impact both genders, particularly in our perceptions, as I said, what constitutes a male role or a female role. And we all do it. I've spent my entire career driving forward the female diversity agenda, and I still have to catch myself sometimes making those assumptions. However, I think, while it does affect both genders, it does affect women disproportionately. Do you know the significance of November 8th for women? Women in Ireland. This is the date that the average Irish woman begins essentially to work for free until the end of the year because of the gender pay gap. And gender equality does remain a huge issue in our corporate world. Double discrimination. This is also known as intersectionality, and it's when we fit into one or more groups. We don't just belong to a group that's Irish. We can belong to a group that's white Irish, black Irish, part of the LGBTQ community. So there's a high degree of intersectionality of characteristics or identity that we need to be mindful of. And they can be both, as I said before, seen and unseen. They can have consequences in our daily interactions, both inside and outside of work. Now, I've chosen this image for a reason, because the biggest deterrent to a Muslim woman getting a job is her headscarf. And this is especially true in roles that are customer facing or visible. LGBTQ women are much more likely to face double discrimination also, with an additional pay gap of 4%. Unconscious bias is very much alive and kicking. And as a group, 25 to 30% of the LGBTQ community have been either bullied or discriminated against at work. Why is this important? Well, a study just published in Ireland from a leading recruitment firm reports that 44% of people say that their job prospects were limited due to a visible identifying background factor. And yes, this increases exponentially when intersectionality is considered. So we know what it is. What is unconscious bias? We know where it comes from, and we know the types of biases. But are there occasions when it's worse? Absolutely. The triggers for unconscious bias, like our furry friend here, when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we're angry, or generally emotional, we're much more likely to fall into the trap of unconscious bias, as we're far more likely to be unable to detach ourselves from those situations. Automatic thought patterns, they emerge, and this is where it can creep in. So be advised. So why should businesses care? Well, it goes without saying that there's both a moral and legal imperative to have equity, diversity, and inclusion in our business. But beyond this, it's absolutely well proven and researched that companies with greater diversity are more innovative, more creative, have better debt structure, and can gain access to funding much more easily and have higher profitability. And more importantly, they can attract and retain the best diverse talent and access a much more diverse customer base. The Boston Consulting Group are reporting that companies with more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenues due to innovation. It matters. Also, our workplaces are changing. and continue to change. We only have to look back over the last few months. Not only where we do our job, but how we do our jobs has just radically changed for us. But we're also at a very unique juncture in time, with 5 different generations in the workplace, ranging in age from 16 to 85. And year on year, more and more women enter the workforce. By 2025, it's estimated that 75% of the global workforce will be made up of millennials, which means this group will occupy the majority of leadership roles, and leadership matters. Millennials have a unique perspective on diversity. While the older generations tend to look at diversity as demographics and look at it through the lens of race, equality, and representation, millennials look at it as having diverse experiences, different backgrounds, and the values that people can bring to the workplace. And they also value the workplace as a supportive environment that gives this space to diverse and creative talent. So what are the consequences for business when it comes to unconscious bias? How will it impact business? Well, it impacts businesses in many, many ways, from talent attraction all the way through to talent retention. And placing EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusivity, at the absolute heart of what companies do is so important. Another study in Ireland has shown that 2/3 of all job seekers consider a company's EDI when considering a new role and employer. However, this increases to 85% for candidates who come from the Black, Asian, Middle Eastern background, and 82% for all females. So candidates and customers place it highly. So we can see there's 4 different kind of distinct areas in the employee life cycle that are impacted by unconscious bias: attraction, acquisition, development, and retention. So if you're trying to attract diverse talent to your organization, what are the images that you're using in your communications, on your website, on job boards? What words do you use? What language do you use? What media do you use to communicate with these people? You need to be sure and be clear about what it says to the market about you. Do different cultures have different meanings for words? Does it attract a different or particular candidate over another? Or does it exclude a particular socioeconomic groups? These are all things that companies need to be cognizant of when they're trying to attract talent. There's an online tool actually called Gender Decoder for job ads, and it can help you find out if your job is using words that are more geared towards males or females. In hiring, talent acquisition, who's reviewing your CVs? Perhaps there's an address that triggers something in somebody, depending on what part of the city or what part of the country they're from. Unfamiliar names. These things can cause people to be excluded. Or does an algorithm do your CV reviewing for you? If so, who wrote the algorithm? Algorithms are as biased as the people who put in the code. Talent development. What checks do you have in place for reviewing promotions? Who gets the good assignments? We can see how easy it is to create inequity in our business if we don't pay attention to these areas. And if we don't look after the first 3 stacks, we're not going to be able to retain the talent. So what else can an organization do? There's a lot organizations can do. So I'm just going to focus on 3 for today. Leadership, leading from the top. It's the most important thing. There needs to be a clear statement of intent. You mightn't be where you want to be, but you are where you are, and that's where you start. Acknowledge the biases that exist in your organization, and then understand what actions need to be taken. Unconscious bias training is absolutely useless if it's only used to acknowledge that the biases exist and nothing further is done. Acknowledgement without action just gives permission for the biases to remain. So we looked at the different leadership styles of, say, Trump and Ardern and their statement of intent and action on inclusivity. Leaders also need to fund D&I initiatives. As with any other important project, budget is necessary. And the return on investment on diversity initiatives is estimated to be about 9%, so well worth the investment. KPIs, you need to measure your initiatives. As the saying goes, measure what you treasure and treasure what you measure. Otherwise, nothing gets done. Have D&I targets for everybody in your organization, all the way down in their performance appraisals and their performance objectives. And mindset, we need to create this mindset of inclusivity. Instead of looking at D&I as a legal bar that we need to reach, we need to look at it as an opportunity where we can draw on the strengths of this massively diverse talent pool that exists. And we do this by understanding what our community looks like, what our country looks like, and what our markets look like. And our activities then get modified to achieve our goals. On the mindset shift, I recently attended the webinar on Cork Pride, and the CEO of the LGBTQ network in Ireland said, "Come out as LGBTQ so your employees don't have to." A powerful leadership message. So moving on from what the organization can do, what can we do? What can you do as an individual? Again, begin with acknowledging your bias. Education is key. And we looked at unconscious biases and a few of them today, but we really only scratched the surface. And I would encourage everybody to go and check out the IAT at Harvard. It's an online test. It's the implicit association test. And I'll put the link in the chat box at the end. But it's really, really interesting when you go on because you can explore your biases further. I went on and I did one on race and gender, but you can also do ones on your attitudes towards people of varying weights, whether they're transgender, skin color, disability, and sexuality. So as I said, I'll pop it into the chat box at the end. So raising awareness is the first step, and it helps us to pause, check, reflect. But what actions can we do? Add your voice to the conversation and put your weight behind any equality and diversity initiatives that are going on in your workplace. We've leadership that needs to push down, but we also need to push up as individuals. We all have this responsibility. I've singled out microaggression here because I feel it's really, really important and it's quite insidious. And it's so prevalent at every level in business and society today. It's the practice of these kind of small, almost seemingly innocuous, indirect, subtle, or unintentional comments or discriminations against a member of a marginalized group. And the workplace is filled with them every single day, little actions that we take that we don't notice taking them, but to the person on the receiving end, they surely notice them. Assumptions that somebody will set up the Zoom call, do some task, or is doing a job because of their gender or race, or making a comment that can belittle somebody else. Comments like, "I don't see race, I see human race." Or one I hear all the time is that women are getting spoken over in meetings, and people, generally more senior people and generally male, are over explaining things to them in front of other people. Is it intentional? Possibly not. Is it still microaggression? Absolutely. So what can we do about it? Well, if we meet these microaggressions with microaffirmations, small acts of inclusion, for example, inviting somebody who doesn't normally get asked to contribute, to speak up, giving credit to somebody else at work, and just trying to gain those other perspectives so we can keep the conversation going. It's much easier to make these small acts of inclusion and a conscious decision to do this on a daily basis than it is to shift a whole culture. They then become part of the fabric of the organization and get included in the company culture. And finally, get used to the discomfort around your biases. Looking in the mirror is never easy, but we have to do it. So if unconscious bias is to be taken seriously and stereotyping and discrimination is to be reduced in a meaningful way, both individuals and businesses have a responsibility to get involved. Otherwise, it'll persist and people will continue to practice that everyday sexism, everyday racism, and let their assumptions decide who gets the job or who gets the promotion. So co-creation between business and employees is key. We have to be willing to challenge our own thinking, critically look at how we may be perpetuating the bias, and not to be afraid of having the conversations and having to take these uncomfortable actions. So my final question to you today is, which army do you want to belong to? And I leave this with you. Companies who invest in D&I see on average a 9% return on their investment. Companies with more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenues. And employees with diverse backgrounds bring their own perspectives, ideas, and experiences and help create high-performing, talented, resilient organizations. Forward-thinking companies know this, and they should be looking at ways to empower and value and include this diverse workforce that is part of our society now. It's not only a legal and moral obligation, it's also a very, very sound business strategy. So thank you, and I will take any questions that are there. I'm just going to pause share there. Jump into the chat box. So, okay, how do you increase gender diversity in industries that are male dominant, e.g. engineering? We're working for an engineering company with less than 5% females, and they want higher female participation but are struggling as female. Okay, that's a great question. So I think it's very, very difficult to put a quick fix in place, if I'm honest. I think it's really about partnering with institutions early on to make sure that we're all working together to try and increase the attraction of female engineers into our third levels and then growing them up through the industry. I think as well doing things like showcasing, having speakers come in to universities and into schools to try and bring people along in the beginning. It's a very, very good way to do it. I think a statement as well to the market that this company is looking actively seeking to recruit female engineers is probably a good way to do it as well. And again, as I said, the 4 stages of talent, you know, maybe taking another look at how they're advertising these roles, the language that they're using, look at gender decoder, and maybe the media that they're using may inadvertently be discouraging females from applying for jobs. Okay. So does anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Well, if that's everything, I would like to say a huge thank you, as always, to the Republic of Work, the whole team for their support. They've shown such commitment to Cork businesses, I think, throughout COVID and throughout the fantastic events that they continue to put on. And a special thanks to Angie today, who has been piloting the virtual door for me. And just to say, if anybody wants any further information or would like to link in with me, just get in touch. Our website address is up there, dragonflycoaching.ie, and absolutely get in touch with me. And I've just remembered that I didn't put the link into the bias, so I'm going to push that into the chat now. Okay, so if anybody wants to take that implicit association test, it's very, very interesting, and don't be shocked by your results. That's all I'll say. Okay, can I share the link? Okay, so I think that's it. So I don't have anything else for you today, but it's been great to be able to present to you, and thank you all for your lovely comments. So do link in with me and do get in touch. Thank you.